The evening shift was just beginning at Metropolitan General Hospital when Nurse Chen walked through the sliding glass doors, her crisp blue scrubs rustling as she moved. After 15 long years of nursing at smaller clinics, this was her first day at one of the city's biggest hospitals, and butterflies danced in her stomach despite her experience. The emergency department buzzed with activity, the beeping of monitors, wheels of gurneys squeaking against the polished floor, and the constant chatter of medical staff created a symphony she knew all too well. Yet something felt different here. The walls were brighter, the equipment newer, and most noticeably, the staff was far more diverse than what she was used to at her old workplace. As she stood at the nurse's station, organizing her files for the shift, she couldn't help but feel a bit proud. She had built quite a reputation over the years. Doctors had always praised her attention to detail, her quick thinking in emergencies, and her strict adherence to protocols. Some even said she ran her floor like a tight ship, a compliment she wore like a badge of honor. "You must be the new nurse," a friendly voice called out. Another nurse, with kind eyes and graying hair, approached her with a warm smile. "I'm Nurse Rodriguez. I'll be showing you around today." As they walked through the department, Nurse Chen noticed little things that made her slightly uncomfortable. The way some nurses chatted casually at their stations, the relaxed atmosphere among the staff, the informal way residents and attendings spoke to each other. It all seemed a bit too laid back for her taste. In her mind, a hospital should run with military precision. "We handle about twice the number of emergency cases compared to most hospitals in the city," Nurse Rodriguez explained, leading her past the trauma rooms. "You'll find our team is pretty close-knit. We have to be, considering what we deal with every day." Nurse Chen nodded politely, but internally, she was already making mental notes about things she thought needed improvement. The supply cart wasn't perfectly organized. Some nurses weren't wearing their ID badges prominently enough, and she spotted a resident wearing colorful sneakers instead of proper medical footwear. As they reached the end of their tour, the hospital intercom crackled to life. "Code Blue, Emergency Room 3. Code Blue, Emergency Room 3. "Well," Nurse Rodriguez smiled, "looks like you'll get to see how we handle emergencies sooner rather than later. Ready to jump in?" Nurse Chen straightened her badge and squared her shoulders. "I was born ready," she replied, already moving towards the emergency room. This was her element, where protocols and precision meant the difference between life and death. As she hurried down the corridor, she had no idea that this night would challenge everything she thought she knew about being a good nurse, and more importantly, about being a good human being. The monitors beeped urgently as they approached room 3, and she could hear voices inside giving rapid-fire instructions. She took a deep breath, pushed open the door, and stepped into a situation that would change her life forever. Little did she know, her biggest challenge wouldn't be saving a patient's life. It would be confronting her own deeply held prejudices that had been hiding behind her mask of professionalism all these years. What happened next would not only reshape her entire perspective, but would also ripple through the halls of Metropolitan General, touching lives in ways she never could have imagined on this seemingly ordinary evening shift. The emergency room was chaos when Nurse Chen rushed in. A middle-aged man lay on the bed, his face pale and sweaty as he clutched his chest. The monitors showed dangerous heart rhythms, their urgent beeping filling the room. That's when she first saw him. A doctor she hadn't met before, wearing simple blue scrubs with no white coat, working quickly at the patient's bedside. The doctor was young-looking, black, and had a calm demeanor that Nurse Chen immediately mistook for inexperience. He spoke softly to the patient while checking vital signs, his hands moving with practiced ease. "Sir, you're having some cardiac issues, but we're going to take good care of you," he reassured the frightened patient. Something about his casual approach made Nurse Chen's skin prickle. In her mind, emergency situations demanded a more commanding presence. She watched as he ordered medications, her eyebrows rising higher with each instruction. When he called for a specific combination of drugs, she couldn't hold her tongue anymore. "Excuse me?" she interrupted, her voice sharp and clinical. Are you sure about that dosage? It's not the standard protocol I'm familiar with. The room grew quiet except for the beeping monitors. Other nurses exchanged glances, but Nurse Chen stood her ground, clipboard clutched to her chest. The doctor turned to her, his expression neutral. Yes, I'm sure. The patient's history suggests this approach will be more effective. His voice was steady, professional, but Nurse Chen wasn't convinced. Shouldn't we wait for the attending physician? She pressed, looking around the room for support. This case seems quite complex. She emphasized the word complex in a way that made several staff members shift uncomfortably. A young resident nearby seemed to be trying to catch her eye, shaking his head slightly, but Nurse Chen ignored him. She'd seen too many young doctors make mistakes, and her years of experience told her something wasn't right here. The patient's wife, who had been standing quietly in the corner, stepped forward with worry etched on her face. Is everything okay? She asked, looking between the doctor and nurse. Everything is fine, ma'am, the doctor replied warmly, never losing his composure. He turned back to his work, calmly explaining each step of the treatment to the patient and his wife while efficiently stabilizing the dangerous heart rhythm. Nurse Chen watched in barely concealed skepticism as the treatment began to work. The patient's color improved, his breathing eased, and the heart monitor's frantic beeping settled into a more regular pattern. Still, she made detailed notes about everything, planning to review the case with the hospital administration later. Throughout it all, the doctor maintained his gentle demeanor, double-checking the patient's comfort and explaining everything to the family in simple terms. Other staff members moved around him with practiced ease, clearly comfortable with his leadership, but Nurse Chen remained stiff and vigilant. As the crisis subsided, the patient's wife hugged the doctor, tears in her eyes. Thank you so much, doctor. We're so lucky you were here tonight. Just doing my job, he replied with a humble smile. The whole team here is excellent. He made eye contact with each staff member as he said this, including Nurse Chen, who found herself unable to hold his gaze. Just then, her phone buzzed, a reminder about the mandatory staff meeting starting in 5 minutes. As she gathered her things to leave, she overheard another nurse telling the patient's wife how fortunate they were to have had one of the hospital's top cardiac specialists handling the emergency. Nurse Chen paused at the door, her hand on the handle. Something about the way the other nurse said it made her uncomfortable, but she pushed the feeling aside. She had a meeting to attend, and she wasn't about to be late on her first day. Besides, she still needed to find out who the attending physician was for this case. Surely someone more senior had overseen this doctor's decisions. Little did she know, the staff meeting she was about to attend would force her to confront her assumptions in a way she never expected. As she walked briskly down the hallway, the echo of her footsteps matched the pounding of her heart, unaware that her entire world was about to be turned upside down. The tension in emergency room 3 could be cut with a knife. The patient was stable now, but Nurse Chen wasn't done expressing her concerns. She stood by the medicine cart, organizing supplies while keeping a watchful eye on the doctor's every move. Her years of experience told her something wasn't right about his approach, even though the treatment was clearly working. I still think we should document this unusual treatment plan, she said loudly enough for others to hear. It's not the standard protocol we typically follow. She flipped through her charts with nervous energy, her fingers tapping against the clipboard. The doctor took a deep breath and turned to face her fully. His calm demeanor remained unchanged, but something in his eyes suggested he'd faced situations like this before. I'd be happy to explain my reasoning, he offered, stepping away from the patient's bedside. Would you like to discuss it? Several nurses and residents in the room suddenly found reasons to busy themselves with tasks, the awkwardness of the situation making them avoid eye contact. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the uncomfortable silence. Well, Nurse Chen started, drawing herself up to her full height. In my 15 years of nursing, I've never seen this combination of medications used for this condition. Perhaps at your level of, she paused, searching for the right words, experience, you might not be aware of the standard procedures. A young resident nearby dropped a chart, the clatter making everyone jump. He quickly picked it up, his face red with second-hand embarrassment. The patient's wife looked concerned, glancing between the doctor and nurse with worried eyes. The doctor maintained his professional composure. "I understand your concern for patient safety," he said, pulling up the patient's chart on the computer. "Let me walk you through my thought process." He began explaining the specific factors that led to his treatment decision. The patient's unusual medical history, drug allergies, and current medications. But Nurse Chen wasn't finished. "Shouldn't we at least consult with the department head?" She pressed, her voice carrying a hint of challenge. "I'm sure they would want to review such an unconventional approach." The doctor's explanation was interrupted by the arrival of another nurse, who poked her head into the room. "Doctor, they're waiting for you in the conference room. The staff meeting is about to start." He nodded acknowledgement, then turned back to Nurse Chen. "Why don't you join us at the meeting? We can continue this discussion there." His voice remained professional, but there was something in his tone that made a few of the other staff members exchange knowing looks. The patient, now feeling much better, spoke up from his bed. "Doc, I don't know what the usual treatment is, but I haven't felt this good in weeks." His wife nodded in agreement, squeezing his hand. Nurse Chen felt a flicker of doubt for the first time. The patient was clearly improving, and the doctor's explanation of his treatment plan had been thorough and logical. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone so young, someone who didn't fit her image of a senior physician, couldn't possibly be qualified to make such important decisions. As they prepared to leave for the staff meeting, the doctor spent a few moments giving final instructions to the remaining nurses. His interactions with them were warm and familiar. They obviously knew and respected him. One of them even joked about saving him a seat at the meeting. Nurse Chen gathered her things, her mind racing. Something felt off about the situation, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The way the other staff treated this doctor, the confidence in his decisions, the successful outcome. It all clashed with her preconceptions. Following a few steps behind him toward the conference room, she rehearsed in her head how she would raise her concerns to the hospital administration. She was so focused on her thoughts that she almost didn't notice how other hospital staff stepped aside respectfully as the doctor passed, some offering quick greetings of "Good evening, doctor," with a degree of deference that seemed odd for someone she assumed was just another emergency room physician. As they approached the conference room, the doctor held the door open for her with a slight smile. "After you," he said politely. Nurse Chen walked in, her head held high, completely unaware that she was about to experience the most humbling moment of her professional career. The conference room was packed when Nurse Chen walked in. She quickly found a seat near the back, smoothing her scrubs and pulling out her notebook. The room buzzed with conversation, but she was too preoccupied with planning how to report the emergency room incident to pay much attention. The hospital administrator, a gray-haired woman with glasses, stepped up to the podium. "Good evening, everyone," she began, bringing the room to silence. "Before we start our regular announcements, I'd like to formally introduce you to someone many of you already know. Though he's been with us for 8 years, this is his first staff meeting since being promoted to chief of medicine." Nurse Chen looked up from her notebook, curious to finally meet the hospital's top doctor. Her pen was poised, ready to take notes about her new boss. "Please welcome Dr. Williams, our chief of medicine and head of our cardiac care program." The doctor from the emergency room stood up and walked to the podium. Nurse Chen's pen slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. Her face grew hot as the room erupted in warm applause. She felt like the chair beneath her had suddenly disappeared, leaving her floating in a void of embarrassment and shock. Dr. Williams smiled at the assembled staff, the same gentle smile he'd shown his patient earlier. "Thank you, everyone. As most of you know, I prefer being in the ER trenches to sitting in an office. That's why you'll still find me treating patients regularly." The room chuckled knowingly. A few staff members nodded with obvious respect. Nurse Chen sat frozen, her mind racing back through every interaction she'd had with him in the emergency room. Every challenging word, every dismissive gesture, every assumption about his qualifications. Dr. Williams continued speaking, his voice carrying easily through the room. "I've spent 20 years in medicine, 15 of those specializing in cardiac care. But what I'm most proud of isn't the titles or the papers I've published. It's the amazing team we've built here." He went on to discuss hospital policies and future plans, but Nurse Chen barely heard a word. Her eyes were fixed on his credentials displayed on the screen behind him. Top of his class at medical school, numerous research publications, awards for excellence in patient care, and recognition for innovative cardiac treatment procedures, including the exact protocol he'd used earlier that evening. The person she doubted, questioned, and nearly reported was not only fully qualified, but was actually one of the most accomplished physicians in the state. And now he was her boss. A nurse sitting next to her leaned over and whispered, "Dr. Williams is amazing. Last year, he developed a new approach to treating complex cardiac cases that's now being adopted by hospitals across the country. We're lucky to have him." Each word felt like a tiny needle pricking Nurse Chen's conscience. She thought about how he'd remained professional and patient despite her behavior. How he'd tried to explain his treatment decisions instead of pulling rank. How he'd kept his focus on the patient's care rather than defending his credentials. The meeting continued with regular hospital business, but Nurse Chen's mind was elsewhere. She thought about all the times in her career she'd made similar assumptions. All the times she'd let her preconceptions cloud her judgment. The weight of these realizations pressed down on her chest like a heavy blanket. As the meeting drew to a close, she watched Dr. Williams chat easily with staff members, receiving congratulations and sharing laughs. He looked over in her direction once, offering a small, understanding nod that only made her feel worse. People began filing out of the conference room, but Nurse Chen remained seated, her untouched notebook open in front of her. She knew she had some serious soul-searching to do. The incident in the emergency room now played back in her mind like a bad movie, except this time she could see herself as others must have seen her. The room was nearly empty when she finally stood up. She knew what she had to do, but finding the courage to do it was another matter entirely. As she walked toward the door, she realized this wasn't just about clearing her conscience. It was about becoming a better person and a better nurse. The hospital break room was mercifully empty when Nurse Chen pushed open the door. Her legs felt wobbly as she sank into a chair, the events of the past few hours swirling in her mind like a storm. The coffee she poured sat untouched, growing cold as she stared out the window at the city lights. "How could I have been so wrong?" she whispered to herself, replaying the moment in the conference room when her world turned upside down. Her face burned hot again just thinking about it. Dr. Williams wasn't just qualified, he was brilliant, and she had treated him like an inexperienced resident. The break room television hummed quietly in the background, showing the late-night news. A story about workplace discrimination caught her attention, making her sink lower in her chair. It felt like even the news was calling her out. She pulled out her phone and, with trembling fingers, began searching Dr. Williams' name. Article after article appeared. Research papers, medical breakthroughs, humanitarian awards. One headline particularly stood out: "Top cardiologist chooses patient care over administrative duties." The article explained how he insisted on continuing to work directly with patients despite his leadership role. Rough first day. Nurse Chen jumped at the voice. An older nurse had entered the break room, her kind face creased with understanding. She wore a badge showing 30 years of service at the hospital. "You could say that," Nurse Chen replied, quickly wiping her eyes. She hadn't even realized she'd been crying. The older nurse sat down across from her, stirring her tea. "Let me guess. You just found out about Dr. Williams?" Nurse Chen nodded miserably. I made such terrible assumptions. I questioned his judgment in front of everyone. She swallowed hard. I even suggested waiting for someone more qualified. The older nurse nodded. 5 years ago, I made similar assumptions about a young female surgeon. Turned out she'd revolutionized the procedure I was questioning. Sometimes our biases are so deep, we don't even know they're there. Nurse Chen wrapped her hands around her cold coffee cup. I've always prided myself on being professional. But today showed me that being professional isn't just about following protocols. It's about treating everyone with respect. A group of residents walked past the break room, discussing a complicated case. Nurse Chen watched them. Young doctors of different backgrounds, working together, respecting each other's input. Had she been so focused on maintaining standards that she'd forgotten about basic human dignity? You know what's remarkable about Dr. Williams? The older nurse continued, a few years ago, a nurse made a serious mistake during a procedure. Instead of reporting her, he stayed after his shift to create a new training program. He said the system had failed her, not the other way around. The story hit Nurse Chen hard. While she'd been ready to report him for not following standard protocols, he had a history of turning mistakes into opportunities for improvement. She pulled out her badge, running her thumb over her years of service. 15 years of experience suddenly felt different. Had some of that time been spent reinforcing biases instead of growing as a person? Through the break room window, she could see the emergency room entrance. Ambulances came and went, bringing people who needed help regardless of who they were. They trusted the hospital staff to care for them without prejudice. Today, she had failed to live up to that trust. What do I do now? She asked, more to herself than her companion. The older nurse stood up, placing her empty teacup in the sink. Dr. Williams holds office hours every Wednesday morning. He says his door is always open to staff who want to discuss anything, professional or personal. Nurse Chen nodded slowly, straightening her shoulders. She knew what she needed to do, but the thought of facing him made her stomach twist. Still, she owed him an apology, not just for today, but for every qualified professional she might have misjudged in the past. As she gathered her courage to leave the break room, she caught her reflection in the window. The face that looked back at her was different somehow, humbled, but also more aware. Maybe this terrible mistake could be the beginning of real change, not just for her, but for how she influenced others in the future. Wednesday morning arrived too quickly. Nurse Chen stood outside Dr. Williams' office, her heart pounding as if she'd just run up 10 flights of stairs. The nameplate on the door seemed to stare back at her. Chief of Medicine. Her hand hovered over the door handle as a flood of excuses ran through her mind. Maybe she should wait until next week, or perhaps write a letter instead. He's free right now, said a passing nurse with an encouraging smile. And don't worry, he doesn't bite. Taking a deep breath, Nurse Chen knocked on the door. Come in, called the familiar warm voice. The office surprised her. Instead of the imposing, formal space she'd expected, it was welcoming and practical. Medical journals were stacked on a simple desk, family photos lined a bookshelf, and a worn doctor's coat hung on a hook, clearly used more often than the crisp suit jacket on the coat stand. Dr. Williams was reviewing some charts, but looked up with that same gentle smile she remembered from the ER. Ah, Nurse Chen. I was hoping you'd stop by. Please, have a seat. She sat down stiffly, clasping her hands in her lap to stop them from shaking. Dr. Williams, I came to apologize. The words felt stuck in her throat, but she pushed on. My behavior in the ER was completely unprofessional and prejudiced. He set down his pen and gave her his full attention, his expression thoughtful. What made you come to that conclusion? The question caught her off guard. She'd expected anger, or at least stern disapproval. Well, I made assumptions about your qualifications based solely on your appearance. I questioned your judgment without any valid reason. Her voice cracked slightly. I let my biases cloud my professional judgment, and that could have affected patient care. Dr. Williams nodded slowly. You know, in 20 years of medicine, I've encountered similar situations many times. He gestured to the wall behind him, covered in framed credentials. Sometimes I'm tempted to wear all my certificates around my neck. The comment wasn't bitter. There was even a hint of humor in it. But it made Nurse Chen's chest tighten with shame. But, he continued, leaning forward, what matters most isn't the mistake you made. It's what you do with that realization. He stood up and walked to his bookshelf, pulling out a thick binder. This is something I've been working on. A hospital-wide training program about unconscious bias in healthcare. We've all got prejudices we need to face, whether about race, age, gender, or background. He paused, looking at her thoughtfully. Actually, I could use input from someone who's had a recent first-hand experience with recognizing their own biases. Nurse Chen looked up, surprised. You want my help? After what I did? Sometimes the best teachers are those who've learned the hardest lessons themselves, he said, handing her the binder. Look it over. If you're interested, we could use your experience as a case study. Anonymously, of course. A mix of emotions washed over her. Gratitude for his forgiveness, amazement at his ability to turn her mistake into something positive, and a deep respect for his leadership style. I just want you to know, she said, her voice stronger now, that I'm truly sorry, and I'm committed to doing better. That's all any of us can do, he replied. Now, I heard you've got quite a talent for organizing trauma response protocols. While you're here, I'd love your input on something we're developing for the ER. For the next 20 minutes, they discussed hospital procedures, with Dr. Williams genuinely listening to her suggestions. As she left his office, Nurse Chen felt lighter, but also carried a new weight of responsibility. She had been given not just forgiveness, but an opportunity to help others learn from her mistake. Outside the office, she stopped to look at the binder in her hands. A younger nurse passing by caught her eye and smiled uncertainly, reminding her of herself just a few days ago. Nurse Chen smiled back warmly, the first step in what she knew would be a long journey of change. 2 weeks had passed since Nurse Chen's conversation with Dr. Williams, and the hospital halls already felt different. Not because they'd changed, but because she was seeing them through new eyes. Today, she sat in the first row of the hospital's weekly training session. The same binder Dr. Williams had given her open on her lap. That's why we should never assume anything about our colleagues based on how they look, she explained to the group of new nurses in front of her. Her voice was steady now, confident in a way it hadn't been before. I learned this lesson the hard way. A young nurse raised her hand. Wasn't it embarrassing to admit your mistake? Incredibly, Nurse Chen smiled, remembering how her hands had shaken outside Dr. Williams' office. But you know what was more embarrassing? Realizing how many times I might have done the same thing before without even noticing. The training room was packed, not just with nurses, but doctors, technicians, and even some administrative staff. Word had gotten around about these sessions, where people could openly discuss their experiences with bias in healthcare. Yesterday, another staff member shared, a patient refused to believe I was a doctor because of my accent. I wished I had a better way to handle it. Nurse Chen nodded encouragingly. Let's talk about that. How could we all support our colleagues in these situations? The discussion that followed was honest and sometimes uncomfortable, but that was the point. They talked about times they'd been judged, times they'd judged others, and how these biases affected patient care. During a break, Nurse Chen walked to the water cooler, overhearing 2 residents discussing a difficult case. One was suggesting an unusual treatment approach, while the other looked skeptical. She smiled to herself, remembering how she would have reacted just weeks ago. Now she heard them working it out together, focusing on the medical facts rather than any preconceptions. Back in the emergency room later that day, she watched a scene unfold that would have once seemed ordinary. A young female doctor was explaining a procedure to an older male patient who kept looking at the male nurse for confirmation. Instead of staying quiet, Nurse Chen stepped in. "Sir," she said gently, "Dr. Lee is one of our most skilled physicians. You're in excellent hands with her." The patient looked surprised, then embarrassed, and finally nodded. Dr. Lee shot Nurse Chen a grateful look. Later, during her rounds, she passed the same trauma room where she'd first questioned Dr. Williams. The memory still made her cringe, but it also reminded her how far she'd come. A group of medical students were gathered there now, representing different backgrounds, all focused intently on learning from each other. "Nurse Chen," called one of them, "could you help us understand this cardiac monitoring setup?" She joined them, noticing how they worked together. A talented team that looked nothing like the homogeneous groups she'd been used to in her early career. As she explained the equipment, she made sure to acknowledge and draw out each student's unique perspectives and experiences. At the end of her shift, she updated the training materials in her locker. She'd been adding notes about real situations she observed, both positive and negative. Tomorrow, she'd be meeting with Dr. Williams to discuss expanding the program to other departments. Walking through the parking lot, she spotted a familiar face. The patient from that fateful night in the ER. He was leaving after a follow-up appointment, looking healthy and happy. He waved at her, and she waved back, remembering how her biases could have affected his care if Dr. Williams hadn't been so professional despite her behavior. As she drove home, Nurse Chen reflected on how much had changed in just 2 weeks. She was still the same detail-oriented, protocol-following nurse she'd always been, but now she understood that true professional excellence meant more than just following procedures. It meant seeing and respecting the humanity in everyone around her. Her phone buzzed with a message from a colleague asking for advice about handling a difficult situation involving prejudice. Before, she would have felt unqualified to help. Now, she knew that her experience, though painful, had given her something valuable to share. She pulled into her driveway, already thinking about how to help turn another challenging moment into an opportunity for growth. The hospital cafeteria buzzed with lunchtime activity as Nurse Chen sat with a group of staff members. The change in how people interacted with her was striking. 3 months ago, she'd been the stern, by-the-book nurse that others avoided. Now, she was someone they came to for advice and support. "You won't believe what happened in pediatrics today," a young doctor said, settling down with her lunch tray. "A parent refused to let me examine their child because they wanted someone who looks more American." She stirred her soup absently, clearly upset. The old Nurse Chen would have changed the subject, uncomfortable with such discussions. Instead, she asked, "How did that make you feel? How did you handle it?" As the doctor shared her experience, others joined in, turning a painful incident into a learning moment. A senior nurse passed by their table and paused to listen, nodding approvingly at the constructive discussion. Later that afternoon, Nurse Chen found herself back in Emergency Room 3, the same room where her journey had started. This time, she was helping train a new group of nurses. The scene was completely different from her first day. A diverse team working seamlessly together, focused on patient care rather than assumptions about each other. "Remember," she told them, checking the equipment, "every person who walks through that door, patient or colleague, deserves the same level of respect. I once made the mistake of judging a doctor based on how he looked. That doctor turned out to be our chief of medicine." One of the new nurses looked surprised. "You're the nurse from that story. We heard about it during orientation. It really helped me check my own biases." Nurse Chen felt her face warm, but she nodded. "Yes, that was me. And now I make sure to share my experience so others can learn from it too." A code blue alert interrupted their conversation. As they rushed to help, Nurse Chen watched with pride as her trainees worked alongside doctors and specialists of all backgrounds, focusing solely on saving their patient's life. The harmony in their teamwork brought tears to her eyes. During her break, she walked past the hospital's main bulletin board. A new poster caught her eye, announcing the hospital's expanded diversity and inclusion program. Her own quote was featured prominently. "Excellence in healthcare means seeing the humanity in everyone." She remembered writing those words for the training manual, drawing from her personal experience. Her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Williams. "Committee meeting in 10 minutes. Bringing her coffee, the good stuff from the cafe across the street." In just 3 months, she'd gone from merely reporting him to becoming a key member of his hospital improvement committee. Life had a funny way of teaching its most important lessons. The committee room was already full when she arrived. Dr. Williams handed her the promised coffee with a knowing smile. Today's agenda included reviewing the impact of their new training program. The statistics were encouraging. Incidents of reported bias had decreased, while staff satisfaction scores had improved significantly. Nurse Chen called out the HR director, "Would you share some insights about how the peer support program is working?" She stood up, looking around at faces that had become familiar friends rather than just colleagues. "The most powerful thing we discovered is that everyone has a story to tell. When we create safe spaces for sharing these experiences, real change happens." Just then, a young intern poked his head into the room. "Dr. Williams, there's a complex cardiac case in the ER. They're requesting your expertise." "I'll come with you," Nurse Chen said, gathering her things. "I think this would be a good learning opportunity for our new nurses." As they walked the ER together, Dr. Williams chuckled. "Remember your first day? You wouldn't even let me near a cardiac patient." She groaned, but smiled. "And now I'm literally following you to one." Life has a way of humbling us, doesn't it? They reached the ER, where a team of diverse medical professionals was already working efficiently together. Nurse Chen watched as a young black resident confidently presented the case to Dr. Williams, while an older white nurse listened attentively, offering her insights. This was what real progress looked like, not just tolerance, but true collaboration and respect. 6 months had passed since that life-changing first day. The hospital auditorium was packed for the annual staff training day, but this year was different. Nurse Chen stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of familiar and new faces, her hands steady as she adjusted the microphone. "When I first started at Metropolitan General," she began, "I thought I knew everything about being a good nurse. I had the skills, the experience, and the dedication. But I was missing something crucial: the ability to see past my own prejudices." The room was silent, everyone focused on her words. Dr. Williams sat in the front row, giving her an encouraging nod. Behind him, charts showed the hospital's improved patient satisfaction scores and staff retention rates. 6 months ago, right here in our ER, I made a terrible mistake." Her voice was clear and confident now, no longer haunted by shame, but strengthened by purpose. "I questioned a doctor's abilities based solely on how he looked. That doctor turned out to be our chief of medicine." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. The story had become well known throughout the hospital, but not as a source of gossip. Instead, it was used as a powerful teaching moment. "But today isn't about my mistake," she continued. "It's about what we've all accomplished together since then." She clicked to the next slide, showing photographs of the hospital's diverse staff working together, teaching each other, supporting one another. "Our emergency response times have improved by 15% since we started focusing on inclusive teamwork. Patient satisfaction has reached its highest level in the hospital's history. And most importantly, our staff now feels more comfortable speaking up, sharing their experiences, and supporting each other." She gestured to a group of new residents sitting together, a beautiful mix of backgrounds and cultures. These fresh faces won't have to prove themselves the way others before them did. They'll be judged by their skills, their dedication, and their compassion. Nothing else. The cardiac patient from her first day had asked to speak next. He walked to the podium, healthy and smiling. 6 months ago, I had a heart attack. I'm alive today because a brilliant doctor wasn't afraid to try an unconventional treatment, and because this hospital has created an environment where medical expertise matters more than anything else. As he spoke, Nurse Chen caught sight of her reflection in the window. The same crisp uniform, the same professional demeanor, but behind her eyes was a wisdom that couldn't be taught in any medical school. Dr. Williams took the stage next, unveiling the hospital's new mentorship program. Change doesn't happen overnight, he said, but it starts with one person being brave enough to admit they were wrong, and then working to make things right. After the presentation, staff members gathered in small groups, sharing their own stories and experiences. Nurse Chen watched as a senior doctor earnestly asked a young nurse for her opinion on a case, while nearby, a diverse group of medical students practiced procedures together, focused only on learning from each other's strengths. In the ER later that day, she worked alongside the same team that had witnessed her mistakes 6 months ago. But now, they moved together like a well-oiled machine, their differences making them stronger rather than dividing them. "You know," said a passing nurse, "my daughter wants to be a doctor. Last year, I might have worried about the challenges she'd face. Now, I just feel excited for her." As her shift ended, Nurse Chen made one last round through the emergency department. She stopped at room 3, now known among staff as the room where change began. A young black female resident was confidently leading a trauma response, her team following her instructions without hesitation. Walking to her car, Nurse Chen noticed her old notebook in her bag, the one where she'd once planned to write her complaint about Dr. Williams. She'd kept it as a reminder. But now, its pages were filled with something else. Stories of change, notes of encouragement, and plans for the future. The setting sun cast long shadows across the hospital parking lot as she drove home, thinking about how a single moment of humility had sparked a wave of positive change. She smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to learn, and new chances to make their hospital an even better place for everyone.